With this, I would like to officially welcome everybody to our very first boardroom lunch with Adjunct Associate Professor David Pich. And we were so disappointed last week, David, weren't we? We were already and extremely excited to have a formal introduction of our very new Adjunct Associate Professor. We have appointed David a few months ago. We were very, very lucky and very humble that Dave accepted this position with the Griffith Business School and specifically with the Griffith MBA. For those of you who know Dave, he has an amazing professional work life. He has done some of the most inspiring things when it comes to leadership and changing corporate culture. So for us, being a value-based MBA, specifically based on responsible leadership and value-based business practices, it was a marriage in heaven. So thanks so much, Dave, again for accepting us, and welcome to the Griffith MBA family. So I think it's went on the wrong slide here. So today I actually wanted to start officially, obviously, with the acknowledgement of the beautiful country that we are so privileged to live in and reside on. So Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land that we are so privileged to meet, and we pay our respect to elders past and present, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and especially those who may join us in this meeting today. And Dave has, like I said, many different hats, and I think it will take potentially a long time to go through all of these hats. So I'll keep my introduction fairly short on Dave. So Dave, if you like, while I talk about you, if you already want to share your screen for your first slide, and I will give a short introduction on your amazing self, although I know that many of you will probably know him already. So Dave has been an author of 2 best-selling books on leadership, especially on inspiring leadership, on transformational leadership that really changes corporate cultures, and how leaders in general can improve their leadership practice for better workplaces and healthier workplaces. I think something that since COVID-19 should be at the forefront for all of us, not just us in the educational sector teaching into what matters, but for all workplaces. Dave has also been the Chief Executive for the Institute of Managers and Leaders, Australia and New Zealand, for over 6 years. It is an institute that actually us, Griffith University, are extremely proud to be not just associated with, but be in a very close and wonderful partnership with. And I think it is all due to the way that Dave has actually changed this institute, because it is one of the most remarkable partners we've ever had. David advocated sound leadership into this particular institution, IML, we call it, and he hasn't just changed it as a great leader and hasn't just changed a workplace that really needed that positive drive. What he really had done is implement as one of the first, if not the first, David will probably correct me if I speak wrong here, one of the first to ever bring the 4-day week across the entire business of the IML. So he made profound changes to IML's, not just business performance, not just organizational culture, but in my personal view, the most important to employee well-being, especially in the last year and a half. I couldn't think of anything more important. He maintains that flexible work practices must be the platform in which the modern workplace is built. And coming from a very large authoritarian old university structure, this is something that is ringing wonderful bells in our ears. So we cannot wait to have Dave talk about that, talk a little bit about this 4-day week and his experience and his leadership style and how he really implemented this 4-day week so successfully with IML. And now, besides obviously assisting us in just a tiny little way that he gives to so many, he's also a leadership and corporate culture consultant and advisor, and he works with businesses to vision, create, and embed better workplaces. So we are very privileged to have you today, Dave, and thank you so much for taking the time and for being part of this wonderful boardroom lunch. And I will mute myself and leave the next 30 or 40 minutes up to you to present. So for everybody in the room, because Dave has a really wonderful presentation, we might let Dave present first. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can see the little chat box at any point in time. And after Dave is done, we can open the floor for additional questions. So you can ask them in person, which is always really nice to see everyone's faces and backgrounds as well. And if we do not get to all of the questions within the next hour, Dave has very, very kindly agreed that he would actually email back people any questions that they may have posted and he hadn't responded to, or maybe an additional question that they might have that Dave could answer to them. So he will show that slide at the very end. So without further ado, Dave, I will just be quiet and let you present.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Steffi, and thanks to your team at Griffith. If ever there was an introduction that set me up to let everybody down, that is it. I will do my absolute best not to. And the great thing is you've actually done a couple of my slides. So I will move on quite quickly. I run an organization at the moment called Better Workplaces, where I advise businesses, particularly on flexible working. And I thought we'd start. I was in a Zoom presentation a couple of weeks ago, and someone used a phrase I'd never heard before, and I'm blaming COVID. We blame COVID for everything, don't we? But I am blaming COVID. Someone used the phrase Zoom work, and I absolutely hate it, but I'm going to use it. I've got a little bit of Zoom work for you. So hopefully you've got a piece of paper nearby or anything, a bill that you're refusing to pay, something like that, and a little pen or pencil. All I want you to do is write on your piece of paper when you personally are at your peak performance. What's your peak performance time? And we're going to come back to this later, but it's really worth thinking about this because people kind of bang on about peak performance and high performing teams and all that kind of stuff. And I genuinely don't think that too many people give it too much consideration. So when are you personally at your peak performance time? When are you on your game, ready to go? And you could, I'm going to write on my piece of paper, and I'm going to write a period of time of about 5 hours. That's my peak performance time. It could be 8 hours, it could be an hour, it could be 5 minutes. But when are you at your peak performance time? That's what we're going to call Zoom work, but I'm going to move on from that. And if you need to think about it, that's cool. You've got a bit of time before we get back to that. So if I'd done this presentation last week, and I do apologize, we had gremlins in the Microsoft Teams system, and I have no idea to this day why I couldn't get into the Microsoft Teams presentation, but I couldn't, and it seemed that only I couldn't. But if we'd have done this presentation last week, I had just on that very morning of the presentation, I was going through CNN and all the news stuff like most of us do in the morning, and I came across this. A record number of Americans are quitting their jobs. And I've highlighted a little bit there that says there's a willingness to quit jobs. And this shift is not merely centered on economics, but a broader reassessment around the quality of life and purpose. That word purpose comes up all the time. That was last week's news. Okay. I am a little bit annoyed that we didn't do this presentation last week, because had we done the presentation last week, you would all have known this, because this was from yesterday. The Great Resignation. Millions of Aussies are predicted to leave jobs. I think, in all honesty, I think there's a bit of hyperbole in that. But really, that is a repeat of this concept of the Great Migration. So the very first thing I'm going to posit in this presentation is that I think there's a revolution coming. And trust me, I am absolutely not a believer in revolutions. I think this whole concept of mass change is slightly overdone and overhyped. A lot of it's to do with getting clicks to news sites and that kind of stuff. But I do think there's something very significant changing in the marketplace. And that has been described, and it was first described by Professor Anthony Klotz at the Mays Business School, when he described, about 6 or 8 months ago, he described what he called the Great Migration or the Great Resignation. And his claim is that it's already underway and you won't really know it's happened until it's happened. And that's this idea that when you return to the new normal, people are reassessing and reevaluating their lives. And what they're realizing is that they didn't like the old normal. They didn't like how things were, and then COVID happened and we were all expected to work differently and do things differently. And now there is pressure for us to get back to this idea of normal. Now, of course, everyone's talking about the new normal, but no one's really defined what that means. So what Klotz thinks is that there's a mass migration and resignation happening. I won't ask the question formally, I'll ask it rhetorically. Do we know people who have decided to make life changes, decided to migrate from New South Wales or Victoria up to Queensland, for example, from Queensland over to Western Australia, from Brisbane out, from Sydney out? I'm hearing that an awful lot more than I heard 2 years ago. I am hearing that for one reason, by the way. I'm the president of the P&C, just a local state primary school, and our admissions for next year are showing a significant change, and that's because people are expecting to come into the suburb that I live in, Brisbane, and that's typically from Victoria and New South Wales. There is something very clearly happening in the marketplace, and Klotz calls that the Great Migration or the Great Resignation. But there's other stuff happening, and I've just picked out a few little news articles here. You know, The Guardian, the 4-day work week is the future, and here's why. The entire public service in Scotland announced about 3 months ago that they're doing a 6-month trial of the 4-day working week. The Financial Review was talking about pandemic burnout ignites the argument for a shorter week. There's absolutely no doubt, and I'm sure we're all testament to this, that the one thing the pandemic didn't do was mean that we all worked less. It meant that we worked differently, potentially from different locations, not from the office, from home. But I hear very few people in office-based roles that worked less. There are obviously some sectors that couldn't work because of lockdowns and things like that. But in office-based roles, there were very few people that worked less. On a couple of things I noticed last week. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I'm kind of very interested in this because I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. They announced in the US that their 40,000 staff didn't have to go into the office anymore. And when they made that announcement, they didn't say this was a temporary solution. They said that this was their new normal. That's going to make a significant difference for things like real estate for PricewaterhouseCoopers. If you allow all your staff to just work from home, some of them may not, of course, but a whole bunch of them will. And then I found this article, which was basically an analysis of leaders basically saying that flexibility is overrated. My argument through this presentation is you can fiddle while Rome burns, but Rome is going to burn. So the leaders that are saying that flexibility is overrated, unfortunately, in my view, are going to have to get onto the bandwagon very, very quickly, or things are going to start happening to the businesses that they lead. And then I found this I found really interesting. So I was, as we all do, I was flicking through Seek, and I found this. This was a job advertised at a fantastic little consulting business down in Victoria called Inventium. I encourage you all to go and check out Inventium. I encourage you all to go and grab the Inventium podcast. There are 2 fantastic Inventium podcasts on the 4-day week. They form part of my story of when I introduced the 4-day week. But here's a job ad, and you can see on the right-hand side there, we currently work a 4-day week. This means 80% of time for 100% of salary and 100% of productivity. Doesn't that sound great? And then a little bit further down, we have this thing here. We work fully remotely and structure our working times around our optimal body-brain rhythms, or our chronotype. And we operate under a be your own boss structure, BYOB. The very last one there, we hate unnecessary meetings. That was actually a job ad that I just found on Seek. And here's the thing, I haven't asked the fabulous people that run Inventium. I wonder how many applications they got for that job. And I wonder how many people in the Great Migration, the Great Resignation, were looking at that job saying, well, I'd rather do that than the job I'm doing at the moment. So the question I'd like to ask in this presentation and in this discussion is a flexible future possible? Is it rainbows and unicorns, or is it pie in the sky? And before I do that, I think I just need to explain why we're talking about flexibility. And I believe, and I came to believe this about 2.5 years ago on a trip to Auckland, and I'll explain about that trip to Auckland a little bit later. because it also forms part of the story. But I believe that flexibility and flexible working practice lies at the heart of leadership. So just as Einstein believed that the workings of the universe could be explained or were explicable, and he, of course, came up with E = mc squared as the answer to many of the problems of the universe or the questions of the universe. I believe that there is a problem of leadership, okay? And I believe that there's what I've called the leadership conundrum and the problem with modern leadership. And I'm going to share this with you now. And when I do this, I have to point out, because it is going to raise a smile for anybody that's got a kind of scientific or mathematical background, but I believe that there is a leadership conundrum, and it looks a little bit like this, right? So in modern leadership, you're expected to get results, whatever those results are. So your results, budget, membership, turnover, whatever your personal results are in the business that you work in. And then I think there's also the primary purpose of the leader or manager or leadership or management. I couldn't use L for leadership because you'll see why I couldn't use that. So I've used P, which is the primary purpose of the manager and the leader. And then, of course, in the equation, there's T, which is time, which is the time that you've got to get the job done. You know, a leader has a certain number of people, and all of those people work a certain number of hours, which all fits into a budget. You know, I've run an organization. That's how it works. You're given a certain amount of budget for headcount, and you've got to achieve your objectives and your goals and your results using the time that equates to your budget. And then, of course, you've got your staff, your resources, your people, all of your resources. I couldn't call it R because it doesn't fit with what I'm about to show you. So again, I'm not a mathematician, but if you put all that together, you have what I call the leadership conundrum. So you've got your results, and they're a function of the primary purpose of the leader and the time that she, the leader, has, and the resources or the staff that leader has at their disposal. So R = PTS. Okay. Now, the problem I see in this leadership conundrum is that the definitions of many of those things are incorrect. So here's what I think the traditional definitions of these things are. So the idea of a leader is the person that manages the team to get stuff done using a variety of leadership styles. You know, how many of these things do we go on where we assess people's leadership styles and we try to work out whether they're a good fit to be a leader? You know, the very typical one we hear, of course, is that extroverts make good leaders and introverts make bad leaders. It's absolute nonsense, of course. But you know, there's millions of dollars been made and millions of books been sold on this primary purpose of a leader being getting stuff done using a leadership style. It's total nonsense. Time is always defined as this idea that you try to squeeze out as much time as possible, and you try to find that sweet spot where you're squeezing out as much time, but you're trying to stop people getting stressed and burnt out. So you're trying to find that point and set KPIs so you don't burn people out. And then, of course, you've got staff, and typically leaders are told either by their boards or by the people above them that you need to recruit the staff that fits the culture of an organization and fit your leadership style. But of course, if you've got your leadership style wrong and you've got the definition of time wrong, then you're probably recruiting the wrong people anyway. So I completely reject those traditional definitions in the leadership conundrum. In fact, not only do I reject them, I actually put my theory in. And now you can see why I've fudged my little leadership conundrum here, because I believe that the current way that results are attained, and then if you add my theory in, you end up with PTSD. And PTSD is exactly what's happening in organizations at the moment. And this isn't about me explaining that stress in organizations is a common thread and is an absolutely live and real issue. I don't need to explain that. That's for a different day. But I have put a couple of things up here that everybody knows this. So everybody knows that mental health in the workplace, bullying, stress, harassment, all of those kind of things are a feature of the modern workplace. And one of the key driving factors of why I believe that the common leadership conundrum is underpinned by stress is the fact that it is almost impossible these days to separate your work from your home life. there has been a merging of work and home life. So essentially in the past, you could separate those things and you could work out where trauma was coming from. And as Duffy at the Carlson School of Management says, when you're spending more than 40 hours of your waking week in the workplace, and there's been a merging of work and home life, it's almost impossible to consider things as personal problems. And we all know that that, or some aspect of that, is true. Anybody that works in HR, anybody that leads teams, anybody that studies fair work at the moment and sees the number of bullying and harassment cases going through fair work knows that that's absolutely a fact. So here's the problem. I think in the leadership conundrum, we've got the definitions of P wrong. We've got the definition of leadership wrong. We've got the definition of T wrong. In actual fact, I'm going to argue that T shouldn't even be part of the leadership equation. Simply by putting T in the time, in the leadership conundrum, you are causing problems for your staff. And I think we've got the definition of S wrong. So by the way, if those are so what I've put back up there are the traditional definitions. I reject those definitions, and here's what I think the definitions should be of leadership, for example. So in leadership, I believe the primary purpose of the leader is to create an environment or a workplace that allows people to succeed. So if you're a leader, your job is to set people up to succeed, to do their job, to do what you've recruited them for, and to allow them to succeed. The next thing I believe is that time is nonsense. Time is absolute. So if you believe that you're setting up an environment so that people succeed, you can immediately take time out of the equation, because time is absolutely pointless. If you're allowing people to succeed and to set up an environment where people succeed, time doesn't come into the equation. And what you have to do is recruit people that fit into that definition of leadership, which doesn't necessarily mean that they reflect you, of course. It means that they reflect the environment that you're recruiting them into. So I reject this idea of introvert, extrovert, all of those semi-psychological tests that people do to work out whether you're right for an organization. It's typically to find out whether you're right to work for that leader. So I believe that in the modern leadership, the best way of solving the leadership conundrum is to remove time completely from the equation. In fact, I go one step further than that, and I say that the removal of time from the leadership equation is the answer to the leadership conundrum and can lead to the attainment of the results for the business. Because this, by the way, is not necessarily just about being nice to people. This is about achieving the results for the business. So if anybody is as old as me, and there are very few people on here that will be, I don't know whether you remember back in the day, there was a fantastic science fiction comedy TV series called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Any of us that watched that back in the late 80s and early 90s will remember that we went through about 15 different series of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they were trying to discover what the secret to the universe was. And they eventually found a huge supercomputer called Deep Thought, and Deep Thought solved the problem to the universe. And that problem to the universe was 42. And we were all incredibly stunned and disappointed that that was how The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy ended. My view is that the solution, the overall solution to the leadership conundrum is F. You introduce flexible working, and flexible working can open the doors to a whole new way of achieving results. And I'm now going to illustrate one very, very tiny example as to why flexible working is important. So, for example, if we believe that we want to recruit people who are operating at peak performance, okay, my question is, have we had the conversations with our people about when they're at peak performance? Because if we haven't had conversations with our staff about when we're at peak performance, how do we know that we're allowing our staff to operate at peak performance? So we've all written down our times. If we all turn our cameras on, we're now going to share with each other when we are at peak performance. And this is always quite exciting. I will share my peak performance time. It is 5 a.m. till 11 a.m. Of course, I will now say that if this presentation doesn't go too well, I'm outside my peak performance time. But when this presentation was being set up, by the way, nobody asked me when my peak performance time was, and yet I'm expected to be at peak performance. When's everybody else's peak performance time? So if we turn around our pieces of paper, mine's 5 till 11 a.m. Peak performance, I get up every morning at 3 a.m. I go for a run. What's yours there, Morella? I can't see that.
Before lunch and after lunch.
Before and after lunch.
10 to 12 and 1 to 3:30.
Yeah, okay. So, Steffi, yours was 5 till 12, I think.
I'd be the one jogging next to you, Dave.
Yeah, there you go.
Mirella makes herself her first coffee.
So you see, the interesting thing is, when we talk about flexibility, if we've all analyzed each other's peak performances, what you start to realize is people perform at their peak at different times of the day. One of the key things that could come out of this presentation is anybody working in teams, anybody that's got people working for them, anybody that works for other people but feels able to have these conversations, I truly encourage you to go and have that conversation with people, because that was one of the things at IML that completely opened my eyes to the way that I was leading people. I was expecting my team to be at peak performance to achieve their KPIs. I'd never once asked the people when they were at peak performance. And I hadn't set the workplace up so that they could be at peak performance. And we talk about high performing teams, and I don't think those conversations happen frequently enough. So I'm going to talk a little bit about flexible working, but we have to be very, very clear here that there are a number of different ways that we can introduce flexible working into the workplace. And I've put some of them up here. I'm going to talk about one specific implementation of what I believe is a very useful and proven method of introducing flexible working. It's called the 4-day week, and it is being mass talked about at the moment. You can't open LinkedIn or open a conglomerated news site without reading something about flexible working. But I do have to just reiterate that it is merely one idea. It's an idea that I've implemented, and it's a very specific implementation of flexible working. But it is, in my view, the one way of recognizing that and acknowledging that people work differently and people peak in their performance at different times. In actual fact, I think it's the best expression of acknowledging the differences in the workforce and in the differences that people have in getting to peak performance. And again, I want to reiterate that when I'm talking about the 4-day week, I'm genuinely not talking about introducing this because we're nice. This isn't about being nice. That is a byproduct. It is a nice thing to do. And of course, the staff at IML, when we introduced it, were whooping and jumping and popping champagne corks. That wasn't why we did it. We did it because we wanted to meet the results and the KPIs that had been set by the business. So when we talk about the 4-day week, I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 things. I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to talk about horses for courses. I'm going to explain why it's a leap in the light and not a leap in the dark. I'm going to explain what happened and how we did it. And then I'm going to talk about the outcome of it. So to set the scene, this was the scene in the IML business, but this is the scene in almost any business. Now you can pick, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can look at that screen and you can pick any of those little electronic post-it notes, and we can talk about any of them that you like. I would say that they are all relevant for pretty much every business. I'm going to pick out one, by the way, just because it's a bit controversial, and it's the one that you probably wouldn't think is controversial, but it really is, and it's that the modern day employment contract is defunct. I firmly believe that the modern day employment contract is such nonsense. Everybody knows it's nonsense, and the law takes a long, long time to catch up with what's happening on the ground. And if you don't believe that the modern day employment contract is defunct, I would encourage you this evening when you go home, or if you're already working at home, to find your employment contract, read it, and stop yourself laughing. because it isn't what you do in your job. My contract at IML said that I would work 37.5 days a week, that I would take 45 minutes for lunch, and it said that my hours were from 9 till 5:30. It's absolute nonsense. That isn't what happened at all. And by the way, I didn't have an expectation that that would be what it was, but it wasn't happening. I maintain that modern employment contracts are inherently dishonest. So one of the pushbacks that you get with the 4-day week is, well, what about the contract? My argument in counter to that is, well, the contract's nonsense anyway. So let's just start by acknowledging the nonsensicalness of the modern day employment contract and work from there. So the contract is defunct. There's all of those other things happening. You know, there's the idea that we're always on, the merging of home and work. There's all the stuff about mental health and well-being. Crucially, there's all the stuff about productivity and profit. We have expectations of boards and shareholders. We're told to work smarter and not harder, whatever that means. We have to achieve the goals of the organization. And then there's all that stuff about employee of choice. You know, we all want, as employers, we all want to be nominated and win awards and be employers of choice and all of that kind of stuff. That was the scene that IML was in when we started to think about the 4-day week. However, what I believe that you have to do in your starting point when you're looking at flexible working is, it's horses for courses. You've got to work out what your specific issues are in your own business, and you can't generalize those. You've got to do some research and find out what your issues are. Here are the issues that we discovered at IML, and I'm going to just talk about one of those issues, and that's the third one down, stress. So here's what was happening at IML. We were going through a massive period of change, and we'd gone from 12 staff to 70 staff in a very short period of time. We'd introduced a whole new strategy, all of that kind of stuff. We had very, very, very high employee engagement. You'd expect that, you know, we're a leadership institute, and we espouse good management and leadership, but the organization was incredibly stressed. So we had a very loyal and dedicated staff who were very stressed. In some cases, that's about the worst case scenario, because when you've got loyal and dedicated staff, they tend to allow themselves to get more and more stressed. In actual fact, I was so concerned about the level of stress in the organization that I brought an organization in called the Stress Management Institute, and I asked them to do a stress survey. And the head of the Stress Management Institute very generously did this stress survey, and he managed it himself. And he called me one day and he said, I'd like to come in and talk to you about the results, but it has to be you and you alone as the chief exec. And I thought, oh God, here we go. I'm in trouble here. And he came in and he said, Dave, I'm going to make this is dead true story. He said, I'm going to make one recommendation to you. And that recommendation is that you stop all change in the business for the next 3 years. Now, can you imagine? You're going through you've got a strategic plan, you've got objectives, you've committed to your board that you do all of this kind of stuff, and someone's telling you to stop change. In actual fact, it sounds like a nice thing to say, but actually you can't stop change. Change is inherent in business. And in an organization like IML, if you stop change, you die. So there was absolutely no way that I could stop change, but I had a very stressed out organization. So those were our issues. You know, we wanted to be an employee of choice. We wanted to live our vision and purpose, better managers, better leaders for a better society, all that kind of stuff. That was our stuff. Probably my favorite slide, mainly because it took me a long, long time to find that image. What's this image saying? You've got to work out what nut you want to crack with flexibility. What a perfect slide for that. You've got to find out what nut you want to crack. Okay, so you're not going to solve everything, but what do you actually want to solve? What are your priorities? So what we did at IML was we decided there were 3 major priorities. We wanted to embolden and accelerate the strategic and cultural change in the business. We wanted to reduce stress amongst our staff, and we wanted to be seen as an employee of choice. There were other things, but those took, if you like, a backseat. They were just at the back of our mind, but these were the nuts that we wanted to crack with an approach to flexible working. And we then started to investigate what options for flexible working there were and what options for cultural change. And we investigated a number of things, and one of them kept jumping out, and it was what I call the Big Bang. It was, we could chip away at this, or we could blow the whole thing up. And for those people that know me, I'm a bit of sometimes a bit of a fan of blowing things up, because you can chip away at things and eventually the bad habits creep back in and the stress creeps back up. And one of the objections we got was, well, is this a leap in the dark? Because has this been done before? And the funny thing is, the 4-day week has been done before. In actual fact, it just so happens that Australia is a long way behind. And that is the case in many things to do with culture and to do with people in the workplace. In actual fact, I'll give you another example. One of my first jobs after university was with Hewlett Packard, and I was in the HR team at Hewlett Packard, and I joined them in 1992. And in 1994, Hewlett Packard introduced 6 months paid maternity leave for women. I couldn't believe when I came over here in about 97 or 98, 5 years later, that paid maternity leave for women was not even on the horizon. It wasn't even a conversation in Australia. So I think in some cases, Australia thinks that things are a leap in the dark, and actually they're not. The 4-day week has been introduced in many, many places. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So Unilever in New Zealand is the test business for the entire Unilever business globally, 140,000 staff, moving to a 4-day work week. They're in the middle of a 12-month trial. Microsoft in Japan has introduced the 4-day week as a trial for the entire Microsoft business. Germany is actually a big leader in the 4-day week. Axel Springer, Kickstarter in the US, many of the startup businesses are starting up with the 4-day week. A bit closer to home, I went over and I spent a week in Auckland, and I spent a week actually going into Guardian Royal Insurance in Auckland. Why did I do Guardian Royal Insurance? Because that book down there at the bottom, and this book sits on my desk constantly, and I quite often refer to it. And that book, The 4-Day Week, was written by Andrew Barnes and Stephanie Jones. They both work for Guardian Royal Insurance, 240 staff. They introduced the 4-day week about 2.5 years ago, and they saw their revenue increase by 230% year on year over the year before the introduction of the 4-day week. So it wasn't a leap in the dark at all. It was a leap in the light. And a number of things became very, very clear when I spent time with Andrew and Stephanie over in Auckland. And I will just mention a couple of those things as I go through the implementation, because I realized a number of things that I'd been doing wrong as a leader, that the 4-day week illustrates that you've been doing wrong. And I couldn't believe the road to Damascus enlightenment that I underwent during my time in Auckland, and I'll come back to that. But eventually stuff started to get real, and we decided that we would start looking at how we would put the pilot together for the 4-day work week. Probably need to explain here what the 4-day work week is, because it is fundamentally misunderstood by so many people. It isn't compressing all your work into 4 days. That's not what it is. It's not a compressed work week. It is working 80% of your time for 100% of your salary for 100% productivity or results. Okay, 80% of your time for 100% of your salary. The name 4-day work week, which is the book, is a bit of a marketing title, and I can see why he's done it. It's very simple, but we don't work 5 days at the moment. We work a certain number of hours. This process will reduce the amount of time you work by 20%. So if you're working 7 days at the moment, it's going to take 20% out of your time. If you're working a 4-day week at the moment, it will take 0.8%, 0.8 days out of your time. It is a reduction in working time by 20%. And the philosophy that we started with was that we wanted to empower our staff to achieve their KPIs. So it was a business imperative. Crucially, we wanted to focus entirely on output and not on hours worked. That is an absolute fundamental part of the 4-day work week. You take time out of the equation. And crucially, back to our cards here, the the pieces of paper that we wrote on, we recognize that people work differently. We recognize that there are people in our teams that want to work different hours and different days for a myriad of different reasons. And we accept that that is life and that that is a modern workforce. Not everybody wants to, like I do, get up at 3:30 in the morning, go for a run and start work at 5. Because the flip side of my working day, by the way, is I'm terrible after 3 o'clock. Can't do anything. I'm really tired. I want to go home, and I typically go to bed at between 7 and 8. Not everybody wants to work like that. It's about recognizing that people work differently. Crucially, you are absolutely crucially in the philosophy of the 4-day week is you have to be honest. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with your team, and you have to be honest with your co-workers. There is no point me saying I'm at peak performance from 9 in the morning till 7 at night, because that sounds really great for my ego. It's absolutely not true. You have to be honest. The other thing that we wanted to do in our philosophy was increase teamwork and collaboration. And what we found, and I'll talk about the results in a second, it's a complete misnomer. It's a complete misinterpretation that teamwork reduces by reducing the amount of time that people are at work. The absolute opposite of that was true. And also we wanted to be known to be acting, not just saying. I think one of the problems with modern leadership is that so many people say things and so many people use platitudes and words that they've read in books. But we wanted to actually be action focused rather than saying that we believed in flexible working. That's back to my thoughts on high performing teams and peak performance. Everyone talks about it, but there's very little action about those things. And then finally, we wanted to attract different kinds of staff. We wanted to attract staff that could fit into that philosophy. And we wanted to change our recruitment process. So what we did was we implemented a 10-step plan. That 10-step plan started with exec team planning and establishing a benchmark. I'll talk about the benchmark in a second because it was actually really important. And then we did what we call the fun bit, which was designing the 4-day week. The key thing that we did here is we asked the staff to design the 4-day week. I wasn't involved in that at all. Otherwise, I designed my own 4-day week, but we asked the staff to design the 4-day week. And then we launched, we called it the game of the gift of time. So I stole that from Game of Thrones, of course, but we called it the gift of time. We were gifting our staff time. And then we launched a 6-month pilot. We measured monthly against improvement or decline against the pilot. And then we did some changes, which we call the nitty gritty. We did some changes on the go. We reviewed the pilot result. And then of course we were heading towards the permanent implementation of the gift of time. I'll just talk about the benchmark. It's really important that we talk about the benchmark. So we took 3 things as benchmark, okay? And we measured these things before we started the pilot. And absolutely crucially, we didn't tell the staff why we were measuring these things. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that we didn't tell the staff that we were thinking of implementing a 4-day week, because of course we thought that the staff might fudge their results. Because if you think you've got the sniff of a 4-day week and you're asked about happiness at work, you might make out that you're really unhappy at work, and then after the 4-day week answer the same questions and make out you're really happy at work. So all we did was we went out to the staff and we used the Clarity, CLARTI, Brisbane-based consulting company, absolutely fantastic happiness survey they have, fully researched. We used the Clarity Happiness at Work survey, and we got a score of 8.3 out of 10. We already had our stress index score from the stress survey. So essentially, here's what we had on the benchmark. We had quite a happy staff. Actually, 8.3 is a really high score. The staff were really happy, but they were really stressed. That came as no surprise. Empowerment, engagement, very similar to happiness. So the staff were quite happy at work, but they were very stressed. And then crucially, for productivity, we used 100% of the budget. So essentially what we said was the board have set the budget. We're not reducing the budget at all. We're going to change the way we work, but we have to achieve the budget. And we want to see happiness at work increase and stress decrease. And you can see from the pilot results that happiness and work increased ever so slightly. And that was from a very high base. So we were quite happy with that. We'll take anything we can get when you're already quite happy, but stress significantly decreased and we hit 134% of the budget. So just to put that quite simply, right, what happened was staff worked 80% of the time. They had an extra day off. They got paid the same. They were happier at work. They were significantly less stressed, and we overachieved the budget by 34%. Now, I've worked for a number of boards in my time, and I've put business cases together that go for 10 or 15 pages to try to get people to see the benefit of something. I kind of think when you've got that result, why would you spend hours putting a business case together? That is the business case. Of course, the board wanted a slightly more comprehensive business case than that, and that business case was put together. But the conclusion was that there were far fewer meetings in the organization. So one of the key changes we made was that staff only allowed themselves to set meetings when meetings were required. And the only people that were allowed to go to meetings were the people that could go to meetings or should go to meetings. So one of the things that we noticed almost immediately was there were fewer people in meetings. I will use my marketing team at IML as an example, and this isn't anything to do with marketing people, by the way. I come from a marketing background myself, so no offense is intended. But whenever a meeting was said at IML, the whole marketing team went along to it. On the one hand, that illustrated the commitment of the team. They all wanted to be involved in the exciting projects we were working on. But frankly, it was a waste of a lot of people's time. So we started to see a lot fewer people in meetings. The other thing that we did, and one of the key things that saved a lot of time, is we restricted the standard time of meetings to 45 minutes, not an hour. And we found every meeting had to be agendaed. So an agenda was sent out prior to the meeting started, and we went straight into the meeting. We also introduced a scheme of less interruption. And I'll use Guardian Royal Exchange or Guardian Royal Insurance as an example. So when I went to visit their offices in Auckland, I noticed that every single computer on the desk had a little flag on it. And the little flag, you can buy these online, there was a little flag, and the little flag was either up or it was down. When the flag was up, it meant that the person at the office, the person working at that desk was not allowed to be interrupted. So what we found in our office was that many people were interrupt driven. You would be working on something and someone would walk along and you get interrupted, and then you'd not go back to it, or you'd take that work home because it was really important. You were writing a report or something like that. You couldn't get it done in the office because you'd been interrupted, so you took it home. So we introduced a method of telling people that you were not interruptible. We also introduced the concept of focus time or core time. So people could put out of offices on. That was typically in people's peak time. So you could say to somebody, I am not contactable from the hours of 10 until 1 because I'm working on stuff for the business. This gave people an increased sense of control. And crucially, what we allowed people to do is set the time that they wanted to work. And my time that I wanted to work was from 9:30 until 3 o'clock. So I reduced the hours that I worked from 9:30 to 3 o'clock. That was so that I could take my kids to school and pick my kids up from school, which is something that I'd not done in the 6 years that I'd been at IML and I'd moved up to Brisbane. What that meant, by the way, was that I no longer had to put my kids into before school care and after school care. So I started to save money. So I would go and pick my kids up from school. My working day had finished. It didn't mean that I wasn't working, by the way. Because remember this idea that what you're doing is reducing your time by 20%. I was still working after hours, but psychologically, my day finished at 3 o'clock. And there were numerous times when I was walking the kids home, I turned my phone off because I wasn't working at that time. I'd already done my work for that day, but of course I did work outside hours, just as I did prior to the introduction of the first day week, the 4-day week. We noticed a very significant increase in collaboration, and that was because the different teams at IML realized that they could only get their gift of time if they collaborated in a more meaningful way. So we introduced Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft Teams has the collaboration options that were always open and people were chatting and sharing. We introduced WhatsApp groups between teams so that there was instant communication, and that allowed less time for meetings. Overall, the biggest change that we made is that we didn't expect people to work their 5 days that they were contracted to work. We only expected them to work 80% of the time. We allowed people, for example, to leave meetings if they were invited into meetings that they subsequently realized that they didn't have to be in. And I will say, as a personal anecdote, that's very, very challenging when you've called a meeting as the chief exec and there's people saying to you, I don't really need to be in this meeting, and leaving the meeting. We had to accept that. I left numerous meetings because I didn't need to be in them. And crucially, we got rid of blind copying and copying on emails. In actual fact, I tell the story that on the second day of the implementation of the gift of time, I had to call one of my general managers to ask whether anybody was working that day because I'd received no emails. Prior to that, I was copied on almost every email in the organization, and we got rid of CC and BCC. The net result of all of that is that it allowed people to reduce the amount of time they spent in the office, and they reduced their time by 20%. Crucially, what we did was empower staff. And we empowered staff not to go to meetings, to go to meetings, to set the time that they wanted to work, and to work that time, and to say no if there were things that were falling into that bought time or the gift of time. So we trusted staff to get the job done. We allowed staff to control their own time, and we expected the leaders to lead the teams to give the best solution for the business. So for example, we had a contact center, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for the contact center to be closed on one day. So we decided not to do an implementation that gave everybody a Friday off. People could choose which day they wanted off. So the contact center kept running, and the staff in the contact center took different days off. And we expected the managers and the leaders to put that solution together themselves and to feed that back to the organization. So fundamentally, we changed the business and we changed the way the business worked, but it was actually more than change. At IML, it was a complete reimagining of the modern workplace. It was a reimagining of what the workplace means. And I will give you one very enlightening example. And this was part of my road to Damascus. If anybody thinks that this can't be done, I draw your attention to women, typically women, isn't it, who return from parental leave. And the conversation typically goes like this. I'd like to go back to work. I want to do my job, but I also want to have time at home with my baby. And the boss, the leader, typically then says, well, okay, fantastic. You can work 4 days a week and you'll get paid 80% of your salary. And the maternity returner says, oh, okay, that's really nice. That's great. That's generous. I'll do that. And she manages to do it. That's actually discrimination. So what you've done is you've allowed somebody to do their 5-day-a-week job in 4 days a week, but reduce their salary by 20%. This was pointed out to me in Auckland, and I hold my hands up and say that I've always done that myself. One of the outcomes of the 4-day week is I went back to all the maternity returners at IML, and I increased their salary back to 100%. Why? Because they were already doing the 4-day week. They were already doing their 5-day-a-week job in 4 days. So if anybody thinks this can't be done, there's a whole bunch of people out there, typically women, that have returned, who will tell you, yes, this can be done. They just got more efficient. So there were a number of staff at IML that quite rightly had their salary equalized back to 100%, and they didn't have to do the 4-day week because they were already doing it. They were just not being paid for it. Of course, those staff are incredibly happy. I feel terribly guilty that I hadn't realised that myself before, but I realised that when I went to Auckland. So the reimagining of the workplace has been expected for a very large proportion of the workforce for many, many years. I also think that the 4-day week and any flexible working arrangements put a spotlight on leaders and on leadership. They force leaders and they force people in leadership positions to communicate with their staff and to lead in a different way. And I do think that we need to start thinking about these things, because as we go into the future, there's going to be an increased demand for flexible working. I actually think that the great migration and great resignation is happening exactly because of these issues. And this should be on the agenda of every leadership team meeting, every board, every council. If not, we're going to lose staff, and it costs on average, according to the IML National Salary Survey, $45,000 every time you lose a member of staff. Do I think it's pie in the sky or rainbows and unicorns? I believe it's rainbows and unicorns. I've implemented a successful 4-day week. It absolutely works. The net result on the business was an achievement of 134% of budget. Their staff were happier and they were less stressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. That was so very interesting. It was much longer than 30 minutes, but we couldn't stop listening to you, Dave. It was just really, really, really interesting and time. So I apologize. I didn't feel like I wanted to stop you. So no, thank you very, very much. This is going to be recorded and shared. I've had 12 people reach out to me asking if we can please send it to them already. Sure. So with your permission, we'll do that. I know we're slightly over time, but if there is any pressing question that anyone has in the audience, and I can see there was a person I know very well, Gareth. How are you, Gareth?
Hi, very well indeed. Very well, very well. And it's great to see you again, Dave. I'm glad that you're still on the map, influencing people in a positive way.
How are you, mate?
I've recently joined Johnson & Johnson, and they swear by their credo, which when I joined the organization, I thought this is probably just another mission statement or another idea that gets rolled out at the onboarding process and then left in a drawer. And I'm very pleased to learn that through my 6 months with J&J, I have lost count of how often the credo has been referenced. It's also brought into light this hybrid way of working. And one of the questions I have is, what is your perspective on an effective hybrid way of working versus the 4-day week?
Hey, Gareth, great to see you. When I first saw you there, I thought you were on the beach, but you've got one of those fancy backgrounds. Hey, listen, so I don't know. I've actually just written down credo. I want to look into that. Of course, I came from Hewlett Packard. They had the HP way, so I'm guessing that it's an approach to culture. And just, I mean, if you sing its praises, I can only imagine it's pretty good. I would say it comes back to my thought that it's horses for courses, right? I think any approach that acknowledges a flexible way of working, whether it's a hybrid model, whether it's a full 4-day week, I think any approach is getting on the pathway to recognizing that time is not the critic of critical importance. So I'm guessing that the hybrid model at Johnson & Johnson has gone some way to taking time out of the equation. And anything that does that has got to be better than working on the clock and thinking that time has an impact on the achievement of KPIs, because it just doesn't. But I'd love to know more about, now's not the forum, I'm going to Google it, and we should talk anyway, but I'd love to know about credo.
No, it's really very effective, and it leads into the whole leadership culture. It's part of the onboarding process, and we've actually just finished a program called At Your Best. And that was a 4-week program where we engaged, I think there was a team of about maybe 25, 30 people. And it was about this constant engagement about what's working, what's not working, and how do we change it, utilizing the fundamental responsibilities and accountabilities within the credo to give everybody the opportunity to share objectively without being judged. And what I found very, very interesting when I went to the interview, I said that as a chartered manager, that code of conduct reflects so well back on the credo, and I was amazed at how well it worked. So
yeah, thanks, Gareth, and great to see you again.
Welcome. Great to talk.
Can I just butt in and ask, so how do you measure happiness at work?
Oh yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the Clarity survey, I would recommend people go to the Clarity website. So Clarity is the organization that's just introduced the designation of Chief Happiness Officer, and it's actually really cool. So she has the lady that runs Clarity has a PhD, and she has a robust research method of happiness. So it was a long questionnaire that we gave to our staff about the impact that work had on them. Did it make them happy? And there is obviously within that a definition of what happiness means, because of course that's where it starts. But yeah, no, happiness at work I think is an increasing topic that I think is probably more useful than engagement, because you can be engaged but not happy. And I'm not sure that you can be happy at work but not engaged, but I think you can be engaged but not happy, because you can be engaged by a number of things, money and things like that, whatever. So I think happiness at work is becoming increasingly seen as something that better indicates the health of a culture. So the Clarity Happiness at Work survey is what we used.
Very, very interesting. So, because everything about flexibility and having more choice as to when you want to work and when you peak at work, like that to me means from organizational research and from our higher education sector, you really trust your employees' capabilities.
But it is like, Steffi, what we're actually talking about here is trust. I would turn that on its head and say this: if you've got people working in your team that you don't trust, you've got to get that sorted out. Because either you've recruited the wrong people and you've not asked the right, not you personally, by the way, it's the royal you, isn't it? We've either recruited the wrong people if we don't trust them, or we've recruited the right people and something's gone wrong through the process, through the work process. Because if you've you can see the logic here. Like if you've recruited people, if you don't trust somebody and you've recruited that person, then you didn't, something's happened, and you've got to get the trust issue sorted out, because fundamentally this is about trusting people. Fundamentally you have to trust, but of course the flip side of trust is that you can measure performance. So at IML, everybody had KPIs and everybody was expected to hit their KPIs. There was a shared vision and a shared strategy, but fundamentally it's about trusting people. Yeah,
because we have found that through COVID as well. I mean, being a university, having the 7.25 hour work contract, that all of a sudden with everybody working at home, we had to be trusted.
Of course.
And it would be just so very interesting as a research study for our own organization to see whether, like, how much people really worked or how they changed. And because myself, I changed my patterns completely, because just like you, I was able for the first time to pick up my children and to drop my children and just be there when I wanted to be there. And then it decided to peak when I wanted to peak, but that did not fit with the normal work contract that I was supposed to be under. And it's just so very, it
goes back to what I said, the normal work contract's just a nonsense. And universities, I've had this conversation with a number of people, universities are in some senses, they're a little bit behind with this kind of 7.2 hour thing. I mean, it's just garbage. You don't work 7.2 hours a day. It's just about being honest about how your staff work. But of course, you're right. It means we have to trust people.
Yeah. So very, very interesting. I'm so sorry. Are there any other questions? Because I could ask you forever, Dave. There's too many interesting things. Amanda, did you want to ask something? I can see you had your video on as well.
No, I've just had an interruption from one of my children here. You know, the joys of working from home, and someone's just come in to have a chat. No, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's interesting looking at it from a government perspective, and yeah, similar to universities, that 7.3 hours a day, and there has been some really good growth and fantastic results since COVID. But, you know, what does that look like for the future, and how can we continue that conversation and build that trust? To be really interesting. So it's been great to hear you speak today, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Great to catch up again. Hey, the one thing I would say is I did this presentation to a bunch of HR managers in Brisbane, and it was really interesting because somebody was there. I think she worked for Deloitte or PwC. I can't remember, but she said, "Oh, no." She said, "Oh, flexible working in a consulting business is just not possible. It's just not possible." And I said, "Oh, okay, you know, fair enough. We can say things are not possible. That's all good. Not, you know, that's a view." 2 days later, PricewaterhouseCoopers in the US announced that 40,000 staff will be working from home. It is possible. Everything is possible. It demands leadership to get to what's possible. So yeah, who knows? I mean, government would be another one that I can only imagine what would happen, the freedom that people would have if they got rid of that focus on time and let people focus on the achievement of the objectives that you've got. We live in hope.
Well, beautifully said. And with that, I think so on behalf of the Griffith MBA, I thank you very, very much, Dave. It was an absolute delight. And with your permission, we would like to share this with our few hundred of students and thousands of alumni, because I think we can all learn a ton from this. And Dave has put that on a slide, and we'll share that once again, your email address, Dave, for those who would like to hear more, who would like to have Dave's services as well. I think I will ask my boss, David Grant. I think we could all benefit from a little bit more happiness and less stress, and a more flexible work week with amazing leaders and inspiring leaders like yourself. So thank you so much for giving us the time, Dave. We really appreciate it. And we see you very, very soon. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Bye.